You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. Our culture teaches us that we all need to live according to our own truth, but that truth is subjective and not universal. How do we understand universal truth? What did Jesus have to say about it? We're looking at the difference between our truth and God's truth in this episode.
Good morning, everybody. I know you guys just sat, but will you please stand with me for the reading of the word? Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. And with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." You may be seated. And will you bow your heads with me as I pray? Dear God, would you guide our hearts and minds as we hear from your word and your truth? Would my words be glorifying to you and edifying to us? Guard our hearts and our minds against the message of our culture, and open our ears and eyes to see you at work in our lives. And we give you praise in all things, God. In your name I pray, amen. All right, so today we're going to talk about truth. And our own version of truth compared to God's truth. And how I mean truth and how you likely understand truth might be a little bit different. So I just wanted to be clear up front, because I think we oftentimes think we understand someone when it turns out later that we didn't. So let me give you kind of an amusing example. My wife and I tend to travel a lot. We'll go back and forth between here and Virginia Beach, never really that far, or we'll go hiking kind of all over the place. So what that means is that we get to practice misunderstanding each other often. And maybe y'all can relate to that. So when I hear her say, "You have a turn coming up soon," I hear that to mean she'll tell me before the turn. What she actually means is I'll tell you about the turn after we drive past it, which is always fun, you know, and it keeps it exciting and fresh, and we never know where we're going to end up. And I'm always calm, cool, and collected every time. I never get irritated. That's for sure. So back to the meaning of truth. When I'm talking about truth, I'm talking about reality. So like what is true, what is real, what is not real is untrue kind of stuff, right? And I believe this is also how the Bible talks about truth quite often. It's not so much a discussion about honesty or being authentic, the way I think our culture likes to define truth, right? In that way, we all have our truth. I think we've probably all heard that before. We all have our own interpretation of reality. And the best way to identify and define what is true in that sense is to look within yourself. But I'm hoping we can all agree with this, is that whether you're on the left or the right, you're a liberal or you're a conservative, wherever you might stand, politically, ideologically, or theologically. That is often how we hear truth defined and how we ought to be looking for truth. But I'm going to talk today about the other version of truth that we also know, right? The truth that we all breathe air, that we're all humans, unless you've been watching the news lately. I don't know what's going on with that. But and then we're all sitting or standing in this room or watching this or listening to this after the fact, right? That is also true, but it's clearly different than the truth I just described. Right? We don't have to look within ourselves to know that I'm standing here, y'all are sitting there, you're watching it, right? It's things that we can observe, those obvious things. The Bible, however, talks about all truth in this second way, not the first. Truth that exists outside of ourselves. In fact, I would go so far as to say the only truth the Bible supports is truth outside of us. Truth that is fixed and encompasses all of reality, all of us, and all of creation, one truth for everything. And you know what? That's a little bit controversial to say, I think, in this day and age, even for those of us within the church. Because according to research from the Barna Group, 91% of us think that the best way to find themselves is to look within themselves. That means 91% of us here believe that. So where does that leave us? In John 14:6, Jesus clearly says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Meaning God clearly believes that the truth is found outside of us and within himself and his Son and his Word, which is contrary to 91% of us, right? Jesus is essentially saying, if you want to know yourself and to know anything true, look to him, which is 100% not the same thing as looking within yourself. Our truth says whatever we decide is allowed, and whatever we decide must fit within your perspective of reality, and it's your problem if it bothers you. So why do you think we shouldn't look to ourselves for truth, to know what is real? Personally, I think it's because we all lie, we all deceive. And I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable to hear, but it's actually what God says about you and me, right? Jeremiah 17:9, for example, says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Because what kind of bright idea is it to look at yourself, to know the truth, if that point of reference cannot be understood? Or in Mark 7, verses 21 to 23, from within and out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and they defile a person. Right? We defile ourselves is what that is saying. We corrupt ourselves. The place 91% of us believe we ought to be looking to for truth. So in this fourth week of our Reconstruction series, I want to lay out for us how we all trade the truth of our God for our own truth. So let's flesh out some real-world examples of how we all do this before we dive back into that passage that we started with. So do you ever find yourself at home, with your spouse, with friends, really anywhere, with people who have aligned themselves with a group other than the one you identify with? So again, that's conservatives when you're a liberal, or if you consider yourself a liberal and you're around a bunch of conservatives, or you're with people who like different sports teams than you, like Auburn or Alabama, or from when they're up north, out west, down south, and you're from whichever place that isn't, stuff like that. So can you imagine a moment in time where you've been in a situation where you felt like the odd one out amongst a group of people who think wildly different than you? All right, if you can imagine that, hold on to it. So what aren't you willing to say in that moment? And I think in response to that question I just asked isn't so much what we aren't willing to say so much as these two things. We're either going to think, I don't care what people think about me. I'm not going to change who I am just because I'm around people who think differently. Or you're going to be in the second camp, which is going to think and act out, oh, I better nod and go along to prevent issues now or further down the road. Or I don't want to say anything because I don't want to stand out because that'll cause issues, right? So let me ask you this. How many people do you know will actually say what's on their mind regardless of who they're with? How many will be honest and say the truth of what's on their mind no matter the circumstance? How many of us lie, deceive, withhold, and adjust who we appear to be for the sake of ourselves? Or we can lie to ourselves and say it's for the sake of others. Right, in order to not be judged harshly and viewed as being outside of the group we're presently with. I think that's all of us if we're being honest. And you know why that's true? I'm not just saying that. You know, the ones who genuinely don't care about what others think about them are the ones with mental health disorders. They're called sociopaths and they go around killing people, right? They're the ones with neurological impairment. And I say that because it means you don't get to escape from caring about what people think about you, because odds are none of us are that exception, which means we care, whether you like it or not. So our truth is whatever we say or do to fit into a group or a community to avoid being ostracized, right? And culture calls us to live out our truth so long as it fits whichever narrative is approved of from whichever group you've decided you wanted to be a part of. Our truth is therefore malleable and flexible, right? It is not a great foundation to build a way of life on, one that is always changing and shifting. So let's go back to the text now, verses 30 to 31. If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. And Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, they, the Jewish leaders, objected. So what happened here? The group of Jewish leaders were too busy following their own rules, their own idea of how they ought to live their life, which is their truth, their version of reality, that they took the man they thought was breaking all their rules to someone they believed would take care of him, all because they didn't like what he was saying. Not only did they capture Jesus because of the threat they perceived him to be, which was trying to convince others to follow him, which meant to move on from their values and their truth, they could not do what they wanted to rid themselves of the problem, right? Kill Jesus within their set of beliefs, within their own version of truth. That they were forcing, that same version of truth that they were forcing Jesus and everyone else to comply with, right? So instead of living by their own truth, right, the truth of the 10 Commandments, Jewish law, thou shalt not kill, long-held truths of how to live as a Jew, they went around their own beliefs and their own truth to justify their actions. And so their perception of truth and moral rightness was confronted. And so they condemned an innocent man to avoid their own condemnation within their own set of rules that they so adamantly thought everyone needed to be following. And what's crazy is that they testified to that. They testified to Jesus' innocence, the ones who captured him. They assaulted their own values under the guise of fitting in to maintain group conformity and not go against their beliefs, because their truth was malleable and flexible, and they refused to live out their own faith. Because if they were to live out their own faith, they wouldn't have had Jesus executed, right? Seeking to have the person and representative of the group they hated murdered. So let's go back to the text again. Verses 38 to 40. With this, he, Pilate, went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." This passage shows us that not only did the Jews have no basis to condemn Christ, but neither did the Romans. He was as innocent then to the ones who crucified him as he is to us as Christians now, unchanging. And yet, despite the knowledge of this, what did the Jews prefer? The sinner they knew, Barabbas, rather than the man who was innocent but made them uncomfortable with their long-held values. Their truth over God's truth, right? But we first talked about how we all know we lie to fit in, for self-preservation, for group harmony, and we went over what the Jewish leaders did to crucify Jesus, right? They circumvented their own laws. So how does all this connect to what we do when we lie to the Jewish leaders, to sin, and then to the hope of the gospel? So let me answer that with another question. If you look at the reasons we lie, do you think it looks anything like the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders of the day? And ask yourself this: when someone around you starts talking politics, which I think, just to be clear, in this day and age, when somebody says politics, what I think they're really talking about is morality and right and wrong. It's not really politics anymore. And if you believe, right, the opposite of the beliefs of, like, if someone over there is talking about politics and you're convinced it's a moral issue, one that bothers you to your core, a belief that if you are in fact a Christian, you probably believe is based in your faith too, right? A belief that you hold so tightly, when you hold so strongly, because you believe it to be right and true. Don't you usually just stand over here in the distance and not say anything and stay quiet? Or if they start talking to you directly about it, don't we usually just nod and go along with whatever they say in fear of what they might think if they knew the truth about what you believed? Worried what would happen to you if your workplace, your spouse, your friends, and your whole life knew what you really believed. Right? So staying quiet in the midst of culture, or isolating ourselves from culture, is the product of our truth, not the truth of Christ. And we are ashamed of the truth we say we hold so near and dear because we choose to live out the truth of the world, and we all do that, right? And the truth of the world is that we need to fit in, be like everyone else, and that is of greater importance to our lives than the faith we say we have. And in the same way as the Pharisees, do you think you condemn yourself by hiding Christ from those who need him? And don't you think when we hide the truth of Christ from others, what we're actually doing is hiding Christ from ourselves? And when we choose the truth of the moment rather than the truth of Christ, we forsake the truth that saved us. Because we're either in Camp A, trying to shape-shift to fit in, avoiding proclaiming the truths to appear like everyone else, and when we're surrounded by people unlike us, we mirror the world and its culture to avoid detection and fear of what might or might not happen if people were to know of our faith. Or we're in Camp B. We create conflict, right? Those are the people that want to go up and they'll just say the truth to people who are disagreeing. So they create conflict to push back against people who hold different beliefs and have a different perspective of what is true. And in that way, we isolate ourselves from the world we are called to proclaim the good news to. We shelter ourselves with what we know and is familiar. So John 18:36 says, and Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." So we have two sinful options to avoid the truth of our faith, right? Mirrored by us perfectly in the present. Either we are the servants of our Savior who failed to fight in his name, hiding the truth we have as a result of our faith, or we are the Pharisees who actively took measures to rid themselves of points in their lives by doing whatever was necessary to be free of the tension Christ caused them. And we all do that in one way or another day to day. We become like the servants when we're in Camp A, conforming to a culture to avoid the cost of the truth. Or when we're in Camp B, we become like the Pharisees, fighting the culture, withdrawing from it to avoid the cost of the truth. So let's go back to the passage one last time. Verses 37 to 38. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. So the goal of reconstruction is to walk out the process of faith known as sanctification, the process by which we are constantly reconstructed to become more like Christ. It is the walk of faith. And when we abide by the belief that truth is subjective, that everyone can have their own set of values, that truth is not something to be grounded in, but to be felt, and can change at a moment's notice, we are not living in our faith. We can know we live in our faith when we testify to the truth, right? No matter the cost, because everyone who knows the truth listens to Christ. But this leaves us in a rather uncomfortable place, and it makes me uncomfortable too sometimes, because what I've now boiled it down to is risk all you have, friends, jobs, relationships, all you own, for the sake of following God, the one truth. And that can be dangerous. So let's zoom all the way out. Why was Jesus talking to Pilate? What part of the biblical story have I been reading about? It's leading up to Jesus dying, right? Killed in one of the most brutal ways in human history. And anyone know what got him there? Unfortunately, it was speaking the truth. It was proclaiming the truth wrapped in grace at the cost of his life. Right? But if we leave it there, we miss the hope of the gospel, which is to say that the truth is always costly. But it has been paid for in full. And so we're not risking our lives because our lives remain in Christ when we become saved, right? So I'm going to assume if you're a Christian or you're interested in becoming one, you think at least partially Christ dying to save us was worth it. It was a really good thing and possibly the best thing. I think it's the best thing to happen in all of history or human history, however you want to split that up. But where do you think we'd all be if Jesus had decided to live like we often do? To hide as the servants did? Or twisted his beliefs enough to believe hiring someone to kill a man he didn't like was good and morally upright, because that's what the Pharisees did. Where would all of us be if Jesus decided to shape-shift to fit into the culture? To hide and appear like everyone else, or flipped every table he came across depending on who was seated at it? Where would he be if Jesus was like you and like me? Personally, I prefer to be both a servant and a Pharisee because I get the best of both worlds. I like to hide and withhold the truth under the guise that I'm protecting others, that they overwhelm them. They don't know that information. It'll stress them out, right? So I like to hit others over the head with my own version of reality when I don't like what they did. And in that way, I think I'm actually most like Pilate. And maybe you are too, because when Jesus says everyone is on the side of truth listens to me, and Pilate retorted, which I always have taken to mean sarcastically and passive-aggressively, what is truth? I see myself most in that. I'm quick to make up my own mind by considering all the facts I know to be true without consulting God as my first go-to. I decide the truth and then I act it out. It changes every day. And it makes it hard for my wife to love me well because I'm constantly changing, manipulating my own version of reality. It makes it hard for people to get to know me. It justifies my actions, and somehow I end up weaseling myself out of the faith I have been freely given, the faith I'm up here preaching about, right? So as we come to a close here, how do we leave here differently today than when we walked in? I think there's 3 things. We can know that we were saved and loved by grace through faith, not pressured to conform to some sort of arbitrary, always changing version of truth. The truth saved us. And we don't need to adjust the truth of our faith to be loved by others, because we were first loved by the truth. Our job now is to conform our internal sense of truth into the likeness of Christ. Right? And there is actually great freedom in that. And 2, we can pray for a heart and mind willing and able to see where we are in this story. Are you the servant or the Pharisee or Pilate? Because the fact of the matter is, you're one of the 3 or all 3. And then pray for heart transformation, as Bill talked about last week, to be conformed to the truth that will set you free, right? Because even as Christians, we're one of the 3. And finally, we can know that the pain, the hurt, the pressure and turmoil we feel when the world around us wants us to be something other than a Christian, other than a person of faith, because that's all that the world wants, ain't nothing new. It's the same thing they wanted from Jesus. And Christ died while we were yet sinners. That's Romans 5:8. And he died for the Pharisees, he died for the servants, and he died for Pilate. So it's okay because we were saved before we figured it all out. So will you bow your heads with me as I pray? Dear Father, thank you for your word and walking us through what it means for us in the present. Reveal to us the truth of who we are so that we may surrender more fully and more completely to the reality that you have called us to live in. Thank you for your endless mercy as we continue to walk out our faith to glorify you. In your name I pray. Amen.
So which do you prefer to be, the servant, the Pharisee, or even Pilate? Or do you fluctuate between all of these? We were saved by the one who came as the way, the truth, and the life. Are we trusting in the truth of God today, knowing that he doesn't change and his truth doesn't either? Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. See you next time.